All right. Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's on the Zoom, especially to Stefan Moss for being our presenter this evening. Um, I will read his bio, and once I've done that, then the floor is his. Stefan Moss is the founder of the Saltwater Underground Railroad Experience, a Google Earth project that retraces the steps of freedom seekers in the southeastern states in the early 19th century. The project follows their journey from slave plantations, coastal fortifications, and maroon communities to the Bahama Islands, where they developed sustainable communities that still exist today. Inspiration for the project came from visits to numerous national and state parks in the Southeast, where stories of an underground railroad going south to Florida and beyond were told. Utilizing interactive maps, peer-reviewed articles, and newspaper clippings, the project dives headfirst into the stories of the brave men and women who risked their lives in search of freedom, their understanding of the natural world, and use of natural resources. In 2024, the project was granted an official listing by the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. And congratulations on that. That's a very big deal.
Thank
So
you, Wendy.
you're welcome. So let me make you the host.
So I'm doing double time also by bringing in whoever
Yes,
whoever comes in.
whoever
Not a
comes
problem.
in.
Not a problem at all. All right. I'm
Okay.
checking for the sharing. Okay, I could share. Boom. Share. All right. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. If you can see my screen, give me a thumbs up. All right, great. So first of all, I would like to thank Wendy and Siska for giving me the opportunity to share this project with you all. I've been working on it since 2018, and it's been quite an interesting experience. I've learned a lot, and there's still so much to learn. I'm not a historian by training. My background's in environmental science, but these stories have become such an important part of my life, and whenever I get the opportunity to share them, I jump at it because these stories relate to my cultural upbringing. I'm from the Bahamas, originally grew up in the Bahamas, attended schools in the Bahamas. But many of these stories that I'm about to share with you, I never heard growing up, and it was it was like an epiphany for me when I moved to the United States, going to school and working and paying taxes and all the things that you do here, and then finally being able to come into these stories, and it was quite a journey to find these stories, and so I'm very excited to be able to share them anywhere, anytime with whoever is willing is willing to listen. So what we're going to do is I'll share a little bit about the Saltwater Underground Railroad itself, what it is. And why it existed. I'll share a few of the escape stories that I've come into, and then I will point you to the website that has some more of the kind of interactive maps, Google Earth, and destinations where you can kind of read, and there are links attached where you can kind of go further down the rabbit hole if you so desire. And then of course we'll have some Q&A. So what is the Saltwater Underground Railroad? Most people, of course, are familiar with the Underground Railroad. They know about, the stories to free states in Canada. They know the stories of, the journey to Mexico. I was a part of that beautiful presentation maybe a few months back. The professor who shared some of the stories of enslaved people who, found freedom in Mexico. But a lot of people, especially United States historians, aren't as aware of the Saltwater Railroad that goes from enslaved, following the enslaved people that moved out of plantations in South Carolina and Georgia into Spanish Florida as a haven. And then, of course, during the time period of Andrew Jackson's move into Florida, and kind of the plot to re-enslave Black people in Florida, those who could find their way to the Bahamas negotiated with Bahamian records and found freedom there. So this story is largely ignored, but slowly but surely, it's starting to become, part of the discussion. So I'm very excited about the knowledge that's being, talked about and discussed, and also the research that's taking place to bring light to some of these incredible stories. All right, so you can think about the Saltwater Underground Railroad in three phases. Most of the time, when I share the stories of the Underground Railroad, I'm talking mostly about the stories that involve La Florida or Spanish Florida. But really, you can go back even further. You can start at the American Revolutionary War on the late 1700s, which you have are, of course, the British and Americans are fighting, and the British are issuing these proclamations. And these proclamations basically state that if you're an enslaved person and if you align with the British and fight against the Americans, that you'll be able to eventually settle in some British colony and find freedom. I got my first person jumping in, Gabrielle Sanchez. She's jumping in here, so let me go ahead and get her in. So these British proclamations opened the door for enslaved people to find freedom in British colonies that are outside of the territorial or continental United States. So you have stories, for example, of a gentleman by the name of Sambo Scriven and another gentleman by the name of Prince Williams. These are Baptist preachers who escaped from the plantations near Savannah where they were enslaved, and they find themselves in Florida, and they're able to escape from the city at the time, St. Augustine, by boat, and they are able to sail to Nassau, New Providence Island, which is now the capital of the Bahamas, and they're able to find freedom there. And this is 1789, 1790, and they establish a church, and that church is called Bethel Baptist Church. And that church actually still stands today as a testament to their resilience and their struggle for freedom. But that's just one example of, an escape during the time of the American Revolutionary War, where the British are issuing these proclamations and allowing folks to find freedom in their colonies. Now, when enslaved people arrived in the colonies, slavery wasn't, freedom wasn't always guaranteed. Enslaved people still had to struggle in the courts to push off the shackles of slavery and eventually find freedom. And so you have that kind of time frame where you had freedom on some term, although you still had to fight it in the courts to be able to receive it. But now you can jump a few decades later, and what you have are several things happening. You have Spanish Florida now as an established haven of freedom for Blacks. You can have um, freedom as long as you convert to Catholicism, as long as you join the military, the Spanish military, you can find freedom. And so that's the bulk of how enslaved people during this time frame are able to find freedom. So that's where I'm going to pick up for this particular part of the Underground Railroad in La Florida. But you also have, even after this period, the liberated Africans, which, after the slave trade is abolished in Britain in 1807, 1808, the British Navy is patrolling U.S. waters looking for any slave ships. And if they find a slave ship, they will reroute that slave ship to various territories, various colonies where there are courts to try those individuals who were still involved in the slave trade. And so approximately 6,000 liberated Africans are freed during this particular period. This is a little bit later on. This is, in the 1820s, 1830s. You have about 6,000 liberated Africans who were freed off of these patrols by the British Navy after the British abolished the slave trade. But for the purposes of this talk, I will focus mostly on La Florida. All right, so when we talk about the Saltwater Railroad, we're talking about an underground route from the southern colonies. You're talking South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, into Spanish Florida, which is at the time under the control of the Spanish. And when to Spanish Florida to try to claim that territory for the United States, enslaved people that can are able to board boats and negotiate with Bahamian wreckers who have come to carry on economic activity by salvaging any wrecked items on the reefs in Key West and off the coast of Florida. And they're able to negotiate with these wreckers, and they're able to find freedom, safe passage to the Bahamas, where they can hide out and live as free British subjects. All right. And the Bahamas is not the only destination, but it was kind of the prime destination. The Bahamas is 700 islands, about 2,000 keys, a prime haven for cover. There was already a population of free Blacks that lived there. And so it made it a lot easier for any enslaved people who escaped from Florida to find freedom and to live amongst the free blacks that were already in the Bahamas. Or here's a letter from Mr. Joseph McBride here saying there's a query into a lady by the name of Lydia and her children, and in this letter it says here that all of these individuals, Lydia, her children, Eve, Sally, Millie, all of these folks, and have been taken away by English vessels to the Bahamas, and based on the best intelligence that is had at the time, as many people as possible, they're referred to here as Indian Negroes, which is an interesting twist because we know now that the typical language for these groups of people will be the Black Seminoles, but there's already talk that there's lots of stories of people who've already escaped. One who and likely will also try to find passage to the Bahamas as well. And this is General Thomas Jessup writing in response to a from Mr. Joseph McBride regarding the whereabouts of these particular individuals. They're now in the Bahamas free. So an escape route to Spanish Florida, which is kind of where the journey first begins, was established as early as 1687. There were people escaping from British colonies into Spanish Florida. But after an edict by King Charles II, most of you are probably familiar with this, the establishment of Fort Mose, you know, by edict, essentially allowing enslaved people to live relatively free in Spanish Florida. Like again, all they have to do is join the military. They have to convert to Catholicism, and if they do, they're able to essentially live as free men and women. So by 1738, you have Fort Mose formally established as the first free black settlement in the United States in St. Augustine. And so Spanish Florida is established, but there are lots of other things happening around this time. Indigenous Creek people from areas in Georgia are moving into La Florida because there's encroachment on their lands. And enslaved people who have found safe haven in Florida are intermingling with these indigenous creeks. These indigenous creeks became known as Seminoles, and the blacks that found haven with them, if they escaped from a plantation or from a territory nearby, they become what are known as Black Seminoles. They form alliances, they intermarry, they fight together, they have a common interest in defending themselves. Blacks obviously are trying to ensure that they are not re-enslaved. Indigenous Creeks or the Seminoles are wanting to, be not have to worry about their lands being encroached. And so you have an alliance here that's formed that continues on for several decades through the first, second, and third Seminole wars. All right, so this continues for quite a while. You have blacks encamping with the Seminoles, adopting aspects of their culture, and also sharing some of their African culture as well. What you find is that somewhere around 1813, 1814, you have Andrew Jackson moving into Florida, attempting to essentially, turn Spanish Florida into a U.S. territory. And so he attacks many of these maroon communities, these Black Seminole Alliance communities. He attacks the Negro Fort, which is on the Apalachicola River. He attacks Bolex Town. He attacks Fowl Town and burns these settlements to the ground. Eventually, the Black Seminole Alliance has one last kind of bastion location where they can fight and put up, their best defenses. Angola, which is one of the last communities that we hear about before the escape to the Bahamas. But in 1819, right before the U.S. Succeeds in acquiring Florida, a Chief Kanaji, who's a Seminole chief, sails to New Providence and requests British assistance. And a part of the reason for this is because the Seminoles assisted the British in many of their earlier battles. For example, the Battle of New Orleans, we read about Seminoles being involved there. And so they were promised in many ways assistance by the British. And so Chief Kanaji sails to Nassau, hoping to get assistance from the British. Unfortunately, the British offer no assistance to Chief Kanaji whatsoever. They sent him back with meager rations, and he has to he has to fend for himself. Him and his people have to fend for themselves. However, all is not lost. Even though many of the Seminole Maroon communities have been destroyed, there's already a plot to return to the Bahamas, not with the assistance of the British, but to find some other location where they can settle. And so what you have is in the early 1820s, I think the Adonis, the treaty that turns the United States, that turns Spanish Florida into the U.S. territory happens at around 1819. And in the 1820s, you have the first recorded documented escapes of the Black Seminoles into the Bahamas. And so we have archival documents showing Chief Kanaji's voyage to Nassau requesting assistance from the British. I was able to get a hold of those documents from the Antiquities and Monuments Corporation of the Bahamas. And some of the first escapes take place on the island of Key Biscayne. I'm letting people in here while I'm talking, so pardon me if I'm cutting in and out here for a second. I got Kevin J waiting to get in here. But there's at least one eyewitness account on the island of Key Biscayne that has about roughly 200 or so Black Seminoles congregating on the shores of Key Biscayne, negotiating with those Bahamian wreckers and finding passage to the Bahamas. And again, I want you to understand that these Black Seminoles did not just arrive there by accident. They were pushed down to the coast as a result of Andrew Jackson's march into Florida and as a result of all of those communities, again, the Negro Fort and the Apalachicola River, Foultown, Town, all of these communities being destroyed, lastly, Angola. There's really not much else to do. And so some Black Seminoles, of course, stay and find refuge in other Maroon communities, but many of them are able to make their way to Key Biscayne, where they can negotiate and find passage to the Bahamas via the help of Bahamian wreckers. When they get to the Bahamas, they settle on the largest island in the island chain, which is the island of Andros. They settle on the west coast in an area that's very remote, very isolated. And this is where they established camp and they established a community known as Red Bays. Now, 200 plus years later, that community still exists today. I'll show you some aerial and some Google Maps of the area. But that particular community in Red Bays and some of the offshoot communities, namely Nicholas-Town and a few others, still exist today. Those people are still there. The descendants of those individuals who traveled from Key Biscayne are still there today in the community of Red Bays. They arrived in the early 1820s, but they were not discovered right away. It took about 7 years before any British official saw or made any contact with the people of Red Bays. A gentleman by the name of Weiner Bethel, who was a customs officer, discovered some 90 plus residents on Red Bays, thought that they were a part of some group that were going to be enslaved in Cuba, and tried to conduct an investigation to discover, their origins. And they were very adamant and presented their case and told the story of their escape from Florida and the fact that they had in many ways fought for the British. Many of the folks who found their way to Red Bays some of them were actual soldiers, military officers who fought for the British. They had papers, discharge papers from some of the British officers. One particular officer by the name of Edward Nichols, who you guys may be familiar with, Colonel Edward Nichols. He was one of the British commanders during the time of the War of 1812, which is right before the beginning of the First Seminole War. He provided discharge papers for many of the soldiers who found their way to Red Bays, and they were able to show documentation that, hey, they fought for the British and were as far as they were concerned, British citizens and free and clear to live in the community of Red Bays as British subjects. And so they were left alone. Weiner Bethel turned around and went back to Nassau, and Red Bays continued on developing and flourishing. There have been many hurricanes and many tragic events that happened in the community of Red Bays, but even now, they're still there as a testament to their resilience and strength. We don't actually know how many people escaped from Florida to the Bahamas, though. Some made it to Red Bays. We know of the Red Bays community. We know of Seminoles that have been written about on the island of Eleuthera. We know of Seminole populations that made it to the island of Bimini, and those are more so under-researched. Red Bays is actually pretty well researched. But we have no idea how many people actually escaped to the Bahamas from the coast of Florida. The liberated African group, you can say there's about at least 6,000 individuals there. There were 26 documented vessels that were captured by the British Navy, and those enslaved people on those boats were rerouted to Nassau. But in terms of the actual number of people, we really have no idea. I want to pause here for any questions about the Black Seminole story, because it is probably the most well-known story because of Colonel Andrew Jackson's march into Florida and just the way in which those communities were destroyed. There's lots of documentation, historical documentation about that. So I want to pause here because this is a well-known story. If anyone has any questions, particularly about this story, before I move on to some of the other lesser-known ones. Any questions? All right.
I'm
If not,
sorry,
I'll
I
continue.
got here a little late. About how many people were in that Andros Island, those that were, that had left from Florida to Andros by 1829, 1828, I guess. About how many we're talking? We're talking about a couple of dozen or a couple of hundred?
There's about 97 people recorded, and their names were actually published in the document that I have access to. It's a published document of every single person in the community of Red Bays. When Weiner Bethel, the customs officer, showed up in 1828, there were 97 people that were there at the time. That's a very good question because one of the eyewitnesses earlier reported about 200 to 300 individuals, but I don't know if all of those individuals sailed directly to Red Bays. Some folks ended up in Nassau, and some ended up on some of the other islands as well. So it's, as an underground railroad, of course, you would expect this to be more clandestine. You would expect there to be gaps. There are lots of gaps. In fact, part of the research project is trying to fill those gaps by looking at ship registries, by looking at archival documents, by looking at whatever newspaper clippings I have access to. And a lot of that stuff is behind paywalls, but I try to push behind those paywalls and see what information I can glean from newspapers and ship registries and things. Also, church records. The Baptist Church in the Bahamas kept pretty good records, and so there's documentation there. And other places, you can just kind of try to scavenge and piece together the story as best you can. But the British kept formidable records, at least on the group that was there in 1828. There's a document that lists their names and also provides information on property ownership in Red Bays during that time. Any other questions? All right, great. Well, let me share just a handful of stories. I do want to make sure that I'm keeping good time, and I do want to share the website with you all, as well as some of the Google Maps and some of the other links that are available. So, one very poignant story is the story of Elizabeth and Ben Newton. So, Elizabeth Newton lived with the Seminole people in a document that I was able to get a hold of from the University of Florida. It states that she was about 60 years of age when she was interviewed in this particular document. She lived among the Seminole people in Tampa, and she was in a relationship with a gentleman by the name of Ben Sims, who later passed. And then she had a second relationship with a guy by the name of Joe McNeil. And she had three children, her eldest son, Richard, and two daughters. And then she has a son, his name is Ben, and around 10 years of age, Ben is sent to work on a ship. Uh, a Bahamian captain takes him on, and unfortunately, he is enslaved in Cuba, and he is essentially ripped away from his family. About 40 years later, he marches into the American consulate in Cuba. He manages to escape from wherever he is enslaved in Cuba and finds himself at the American consulate and says, I'm a free American citizen and I've been enslaved here and I want to reconnect with my family and I want to be free. Uh, and somewhere in 1853, late October, the Bahama Herald, which is one of the popular newspapers at the time, begins publishing a series of articles on Ben Newton, his story. This American citizen in Cuba is claiming that he's supposed to be a free man. He's been enslaved for almost 40 years. and he's telling the story, he's naming names, and he's trying to connect with family members. They publish the information in the Bahama Herald, and his mother, Elizabeth Newton, who escaped to Red Bays in Andros, receives word of her long lost son, who has been enslaved in Cuba for almost 40 years. uh, the story becomes, obviously a sensational story. It becomes big news. It's remarkable, and the story is, following his life and his attempts to find freedom and reunite with his family. But unfortunately, that does not happen. Even though his mom and his sisters find freedom, and his older brother Richard find freedom in the Bahamas, he actually perishes in Cuba and is never able to reunite with his family. Uh, and so if you want to, I'm very happy to share these links and details with you. If you want to connect with me on the Saltwater Railroad website, I can show you how to access these links as well. Here are just a couple of the clippings that you can see here. Um, and some of the content's very interesting. It says that, when he shows up at the American consulate, he is trying to retell the story, and he names his mother, and he names his sister, and names his brother, and he remembers all of these things, even though 40 years have gone by. He remembers the story, even though he would have been, enslaved somewhere around 10 years of age. He still remembers the essential names of his family members and tries to connect as much as possible and tell his story. But unfortunately, he's unable to find freedom, even though his mother and other family members were able to. All right, another story. This one involves Pensacola, Florida, which is the west side. There were seven enslaved men that were making a bid for freedom. They approach an abolitionist by the name of Jonathan Walker, and Jonathan Walker is a sea captain from New England, and he builds a whaleboat and plots with these gentlemen to find freedom in the Bahamas. So he sets sail with these seven men, and the voyage takes them down to the coast, to Key West area, and unfortunately he falls ill during the voyage, and he's arrested. They are not able to complete the mission of freedom in the Bahamas. He is jailed, and he stands trial, and he is indicted and condemned for his acts. In fact, he is tried and convicted of slave stealing, and he's branded in his hand the letters SS, which stand for slave stealer. And this story becomes a very popular one, and poets and authors write books about his life. And because it's a sensational thing to have a slave stealer branded in your hand, he became known as the man with the branded hand. And there's a book, several books actually, written about his life. And his trial is actually posted in the Library of Congress. The seven men who were on the vessel with Jonathan Walker, of course, they were unable to freedom in the Bahamas, recaptured, and then they are returned to their slave or master slave owners. But Jonathan Walker becomes kind of a lightning rod for the abolitionist movement, and he's remembered for his work in trying to assist these enslaved people, these enslaved men, to find freedom. All right, couple more stories. Fort Zachary Taylor. So before you talk about Fort Zachary Taylor, you have to go back a little bit early. In 1847, July of 1847, there's an escape from one of the coastal forts, well-known coastal fort in Key West, known as Fort Jefferson. And at Fort Jefferson, you had seven enslaved men try to capture a boat and fled. And they were on their way to the Bahamas. They were recaptured, and they were unable to make it to Nassau to find freedom. However, about 11 years later, at Fort Zachary Taylor, which is the southernmost U.S. Civil War fort, two or three families are able to find freedom. They escape from Fort Taylor under the cloud of night, and these enslaved people were actually leased out from their owners to the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps was in the process of constructing the fort, and these enslaved people were able to hatch a plan to escape from the fort. Um, and interestingly enough, as they made their way to the Bahamas, the article, there's several published articles, the newspaper articles that document their journey. And in one of the articles, it says that they were not alone in their voyage. They were actually assisted in their quest to find freedom by by an unknown pilot or a captain of a boat who was from Andros Island. So evidently, individuals in Andros Island, even though they might have, been settling on that island, 30 years or so. Remember, in the 1820s is when the first wave of individuals from Andros made their way to the Bahamas. They were still in communication with people who would have been escaping from Florida, and so it's interesting. A lot of people have a concept that enslaved people were not communicating with each other, that there was not knowledge exchange, and people were not, finding ways to share information. But remember now, Black people were sailors. They were up and down the East Coast, and so information and knowing where freedom could be found was shared far and wide. And so that's why there were so many documented escapes from the coast of Florida, because people knew if they can find their way to the Bahamas, there were already free blacks that were on many of the islands, and they can find freedom there. And so it's interesting that someone from Andros assisted this particular group. There were 11 people that were documented to find freedom in the Bahamas. They settled on the island of Nassau. All right. I think I have maybe one or two more. Let's see here. Yeah, here's if you're looking for the story of enslaved people being leased to the Army Corps, uh, this particular paper is where I actually discovered the Ford Zachary escape. It's done by Dr. Mark A. Smith, who I think at the time that I discovered it was working at Ford Valley State as a professor of history. I'm not sure if he's still there, but this particular journal article highlighted the escape of those 11 individuals, and of course the story of how enslaved people were leased out to the Army Corps at Key West. And here are a few clips of the actual story published in the Savannah Republican and also the Floridian Journal. And I can get access to these documents if you're interested in learning more and getting some details about the escape. All right. I'm sure that many of you guys have probably heard of this, the Creole Mutiny in 1841, Madison, Washington, and another gentleman by the name of Elijah Morris. Uh, Madison, Washington's story is interesting because he was able to escape first to Canada and found freedom, but his wife was still enslaved in Virginia, so he decided to return to Virginia to rescue his wife. And unfortunately, he was not successful. He was enslaved. He was recaptured and enslaved and put aboard the Creole, which was a vessel that was sailing the U.S. coastal slave trade on the way to New Orleans. And during the journey, I think they left Virginia sometime in October, late October of 1841. He and Elijah Morris take over the vessel on November 7th. They kill a gentleman by name of, I believe his name was John Hewell, who was one of the ship captains, and they make the ship's overseer, William Merritt, they force him to sail to the island of Nassau, where once they arrive in Nassau in the harbor, the free blacks that were there in Nassau surrounded the vessel and allowed them to depart the vessel. They were tried in court, but they were eventually freed. Them and about 129 others. And there's about three women and maybe two children who decided to stay on that vessel and were then sent to New Orleans. But the large majority of individuals on this particular vessel, the Creole, were freed once they arrived in Nassau because of the heroic acts of Madison Washington and Elijah Morris. This story became such an incredible story that Frederick Douglass actually wrote about Madison Washington and his life in a book called The Heroic Slave. And here's a clip of the story published in one of the one of the newspaper articles I found. And then, of course, these individuals were property. And so when word got out that there was a mutiny on board, the insurance companies tried to find out and ascertain what their losses were. So here's a document here to the right that captures the losses for individuals who own those enslaved people. This is their reported losses. Imagine that they could publish a document trying to evaluate the worth of these individuals who are now free in the Bahamas and living life. Many of the individuals who found freedom during the Creole Mutiny were settled in communities that are still there today. One community in particular, Elijah Morris, who was kind of the assistant to Madison Washington, his partner in in the freedom about settle in Gambia, Gambier. This is a small community on the west side of New Providence, and that community still exists today. And Elijah Morris's descendants still live in that community. And so, even though hundreds of years have passed, these individuals and their stories and their children are still able to tell those stories, and those and these escapes are still very much a part of the Bahamian culture of um, life in the Bahamas. Gabriel agrees. Come on in here, sir. All right. All right. I'll pause here for any questions before I open up the website. Does anyone have any questions?
Mr. Moss, not so much a question as a statement. And let me also say this up front. My internet connection goes in and out. So if I fade out, I might come back in. Be that
Yes,
as
sir.
it may. I find it interesting, the situation of Ben, in that there were ongoing trips. And of course, there weren't communication networks as sophisticated back then as we have today. But my point is, there were many trips for decades between various different Seminole groups to and from Cuba. And they usually came from different parts of the West Coast, largely from groups that became known as Spanish Seminoles, but not exclusively so. But anyway, I'm just curious, because it may have been ironic. Some people Ben may have been acquainted with, or his family may have been acquainted with back in Florida, were actually in contact with Cuba, not knowing his situation. Not that they may have been able to do anything or not, but it's just something I noted while you were talking about Ben and the scenario he found himself in Cuba.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a good point. That's a very good point, sir. And of course, when the when the British regained control of Spanish Florida between I think it was 1763 and 1783, there was a British occupation, but then it was turned back over to the Spanish. There was an escape, from Spanish Florida to Cuba as well. So there were a lot of people who escaped from Spanish Florida to Cuba, after that time frame as well. So there's lots of communication back and forth between Cuba and Florida. Absolutely, there's a connection there. Um, I
And that
know.
interaction continued into contemporary times, but I won't bore you with that for right now because I don't want to put anybody to sleep.
Sure, sure. No, thank you for sharing that. That's very true. Thank you for sharing that piece there. That's a very important connection there. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just so I can get some dates straight in my mind. So I I was under the impression that the Bahamas there was still legalized slavery there. Was there not until like 1834?
Until the 1830s. Yes, that's correct.
1834, British Islands, all the British territories, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah, what was it for Cuba? It went on longer than that, right?
I couldn't give you an exact date, man. That's something I can definitely find out though. But yeah, certainly for the British, it wasn't completely abolished all the way until the 1830s.
If I
Um,
may, I think in terms of Cuba, it may have been the 1870s or the early 1880s. I might be getting it mixed up with Brazil, but I think it was after the
Definitely
United
later.
States. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely later than the United States.
But Mr.
The
Moss, you brought
slave,
up a good point when you were talking before about the situation in the Bahamas, because many of the men that arrived there still had those documents that they had, in fact, had fought for the British, and some of them actually went to court, is my understanding, having the papers. Hey, we're British soldiers, so therefore, by agreement, we're citizens of Britain and we should be free here.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a well-known individual by the name of Mitchell Roberts. He served with Colonel Nichols um, at the Negro Fort, and showed his documents when he got to the Bahamas. And his his story might not have been a singular story. There are probably several of them, but he was able to show that he had fought for the British, and was able to essentially gain his freedom through that process. But for others, it wasn't as easy. There's a couple by the name of Botswain and Rose. I think they had started off in East Florida at a plantation. I can't remember the name of the plantation owner. I think it's Paul, but they found their way to the Negro Fort as well, and they fought for the British there. But when they arrived in New Providence in 1814, they were not granted. They were not given freedom based on the fact that they had their discharge papers. They had to fight in the courts for several years before they were able to see anything that even approximated freedom. So the situation wasn't the same for everybody, for sure. Um, and I'm trying to think, there's another lady that comes to mind who she did not get her freedom at all. But I can't remember her name, but her story is definitely documented on the website. But yeah, any other thoughts? No, these are all great things to think about. The slave trade was abolished in 1807, and so there was no more trading, but slavery itself, to your point, was not completely abolished. And so you had, even during the time when the Black Seminoles were escaping to the Bahamas, you still had enslaved people in the Bahamas. The people were still enslaved. And so you had very much an interesting mix of people. And to be clear, I want to say this to be clear because a lot of people, it was not because of any altruism or anything like that that, the British um, made the Bahamas a haven. I think it was just a matter of convenience. If you fight for me, if you bolster our efforts, it wasn't that they understood and valued Black people and said, "Hey, we understand that Black people are inherently valued." It wasn't anything like that. In almost every case, whether it was the British proclamations in the late 1700s, or whether it was, you know, um, the movement south into Spanish Florida. The Spanish really, it was just a convenience, come convert to Catholicism, join our militia, fight for us. It was really more so that than anything else. There's not any type of suggestion that these people really were interested. It was just Black people were not valued the way that they should have been, and many of these acts were simply acts of convenience to bolster whatever European powers, were making a claim at the time.
Exactly. I know, especially in terms of the Spanish, it was because they didn't have the military resources to protect what they were trying to hold on to in Florida. So yeah, they look for any
Exactly.
particular opportunity to boost those numbers.
Exactly, and to stick it to the British, it's like, yeah, we understand, but of course, as Black people, we're going to take advantage of every opportunity and every way that we can to get freedom, on the terms that we can get them on. And so what you had were, many thousands of people who were able to find freedom this way, and for some it was a lot easier than others, but in whatever way we can. We negotiated, we fought, we resisted, and that's what we did from the very beginning. And all these stories confirm that resistance continued all the way through, regardless of whichever European power was wielding power at any given time.
Mr. Moss, are you from Andros?
No, sir. I was born in Freeport, but I grew up in Nassau. I have family members in Andros, and I have cousins that lived in Red Bays. But I'm not from Andros Island, no.
Oh yeah, you might have family, man, here. So who are your cousins in Red Bays, man?
I have a cousin by the name of Ricardo. He has kids there. So I'm definitely adjacent. I can't trace specifically any of my family members to the first group of Black Seminoles that landed in the 1820s. I've been doing that research. My last name is Moss, and so at least on my father's side, my roots go to Acklands and Crooked Island, which are communities that are slightly south of Andros. But the Bahamian people move throughout the island chain. We're everywhere, and so wherever there's economic opportunity, Bahamians will move and migrate. In Red Bays, though, there was an isolated group of people. Those individuals that were in Red Bays, they were isolated for decades, and I think it wasn't until the 60s or so that there was even a road connecting Red Bays to any of the other settlements on the island of Andros. So, in the case of Red Bay specifically, they were by themselves for decades, and they endured one major hurricane, I think in 1866, another one in 1899 that wiped out a large group of people that were there, and they actually moved the original settlement further inland because of obviously of the storms that came through and wiped out many people over the course of the decades that they were there. So they had at least two major hurricanes, and so they moved the original Red Bays inland more so that they can kind of find a bit more shelter there, and that's where they are today. So
Well, if you find a bow legs in your family tree, you got cousins here, man.
I know, man. It's funny. The Boleg name obviously is a name associated with the Black Seminoles in Red Bays, but you can find Bolegs now throughout the islands. I worked with a gentleman in Nassau whose last name was Boleg. He actually still works at the Atlantis Hotel there. And I went to school with Bolegs and didn't know anything. Literally, I knew nothing about their origins, about the heroic stories, about how they got to the Bahamas. their connection to the Seminoles, nothing like that until I actually moved to the United States and started visiting parks in the Southeast and started hearing about this underground railroad going to Florida, which I completely blew my mind. But yeah, I mean, I went to school with folks with the last name Bowlegs, folks with the last name Newton, and now that I have done the research, even the Newton name, Ben and Elizabeth Newton, the Newton name survives in Red Bays. One of the patriarchs of the community, Reverend Bertram Newton, there's a school in Red Bays that's named after him. He was a teacher, he was a preacher, established a church there in Red Bays, and so the Newton name is still a very well-known name, not just in Red Bays, but also throughout the islands. And anytime you hear someone with the last name Newton or Bowleg, of course, Andros comes to mind, but they're throughout the islands now. All good. Thank you for that, Lonnie. I appreciate that. All right, well, let me share some of these locations with you. Let me pull up the website here so you can kind of get a feel for the Google part anyway. Yeah, before I take you on the Google journey, let me just show you the website. So here's the website. On the website, I have, photos of various locations and markers. If you've gone to Bill Baggs, for example, the Cape Florida State Park, you might have seen this particular marker, which was put up, in 2004 to recognize the Seminoles that escaped from Key Biscayne. This particular marker is interesting because it talks about, the fact that the eyewitnesses saw, about 200 or 300 or so Black Seminoles negotiating with the Bahamian wreckers and boarding their sloops, and also using dugout canoes, which are more of a Seminole kind of tool to find freedom in the Bahamas. So it's interesting connection between the resources, the resource utilization and freedom. So using dugout canoes, there are some escapes later on that talk about, like, for example, the escape from Fort Jefferson and the escape from Fort Zachary Taylor. Those enslaved people there, they were found with spy glasses and compasses, and they were very aware of the tools they needed to be able to sail and to navigate the Florida Straits to make their way to the Bahamas. And so this idea that, somehow we were just kind of, out there with no skill and no navigational awareness, of course, that's all BS. Black people escaping across the Florida Straits were well aware of the tools they needed and how much time it took to get to those islands. And in fact, there were trade routes that had been established, at least with the Seminoles, back and forth, to the Bahamas, for decades, even before the journey of the Black Seminoles in 1820. So there was communication back and forth, and there was trade back and forth as well. Yeah, so you can find some. Here's, for example, one of the markers at Fort Mose that documents the establishment of Fort Mose. Here's some Seminole documents. Here's Palaklakaha, which of course is Abraham's town. Abraham, of course, many of you guys are familiar with his story. There is considerable evidence that Abraham was one of the messengers that actually accompanied Chief Kanaji to the Bahamas in 1819 to plead for the Seminoles. Their towns were being destroyed, their communities, the Seminole Maroon communities were being destroyed. And it is believed that Abraham was one of the Black Seminole messengers who, kind of spoke on behalf of Seminole Kanaji and requesting aid from the British. Of course, Abraham's town to the ground as well. Later on, Palaklakaha is destroyed as well. So yeah, these are some documents here. Here's Chief Billy Bowlegs and his on his trip to New York. That's a famous photo, a daguerreotype of his trip there. And actually in the back, the far right, you can actually see Abraham in the back right, accompanying them to New York. This lady here, Mama Marshall, she was the matriarch of Red Bay. She's passed now. She was a medicine woman, midwife, and affectionately known as Mama Marshall, well known in her community. Lots of grandchildren and great-grandchildren pay her homage. And she's a legend in the Bahamas, the absolute legend. Some stuff about Ben Newton. And also, if you guys aren't familiar, there's a festival that takes place in Bradenton, Florida, where we know the Angola site is located. Of course, Angola was one of the last Seminole Maroon communities to be destroyed by Andrew Jackson's U.S. forces. And so each year, I think somewhere around 2018, this started. A lady by the name of Daphne Towns, who is actually from the Bahamas and actually has roots in Red Bays. She launched the Back to Angola Festival in 2018 to enable the return of individuals from Red Bays back to Bradenton, back to Angola, where their descendants would have escaped during the Angola raid to find freedom in the Bahamas. She's been doing this festival now for the last 6, 7 years. Incredible, incredible festival. And if you're able to attend, I highly recommend you trying to get out there. All right, super quick. Let me just, you hit launch here on the left-hand side, and the Google Earth part of the website opens, and you're able to navigate to some of the locations that I spoke to you about earlier. See here, let me go back to where everything's already set up. So there are 18 sites currently on the Google Earth virtual tour. I see some comments in the chat. Let me make sure I address those. Cuba, slavery. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, so here is, let me just kind of start here from the beginning. You go to table of contents, you can start at build bags. And so these markers enable you to go to these individual sites. So here is Key Biscayne, where the eyewitness accounts show Black Seminoles congregating, and they would have negotiated with the Bahamian wreckers at this particular site and made safe passage to the Bahamas. And so with Google Earth, you're able to actually get, be here without being here. That's the best I can say. If you click on the street view, you can designate an area and highlight it in blue, and you can actually put yourself right on the ground. So, and you can, obviously, it's a lot more expensive to actually make a trip here, but you can get a 360 kind of a panoramic view of the beach. In the distance, you can see the lighthouse. This lighthouse was constructed in 1825. Before the lighthouse was constructed, wreckers would come here and salvage any items they could find, and they would have come from the Bahamas. But when the lighthouse was constructed in 1825, it actually it actually canceled any wrecking operations, and it made it very challenging for any Black Seminoles or anybody trying to find, any enslaved person trying to find passage to the Bahamas. Because the lighthouse was there, boats weren't being wrecked anymore, so there were no wreckers coming, so there was no more safe passage by negotiating with those wreckers. And so this construction essentially eliminated the Underground Railroad from this particular site for any enslaved people who were trying to find freedom to the Bahamas. So that's the Cape Florida Lighthouse and Bill Baggs. See if I can get you to one or two other places here. Yeah, let's go to Angola. The festival happens every year. This particular site is in Tampa Bay area. So here is where in the 1820s, the community of Angola thrived. But in 1821, there was a raid by Andrew Jackson's forces, and that raid essentially destroyed this community. So what's left now here today, when you go there, there's a park, and that park has signage and markers that commemorate the existence of Angola. There has been archaeological work that has been done at this site, and they have found artifacts that confirm that enslaved people were here, and they congregated, and they had community here. There's about 700 or so individuals that we know live in Angola. And so if you use Google Street View again, you can kind of get down there, and you can kind of walk the park and kind of get a sense of what the landscape was like. The park is actually really well done. There was a time when it was overgrown, and the community got the attention of some of the local leaders, and they were able to create a fine park. And now the festival that happens each year actually happens on this park. And so all of the markers kind of line the sidewalks here. You can kind of walk around, and there are markers. There's one there, if you can see. You can zoom in. Yeah, if you can get further down the road there, you can see the marker. Let me see if I can get down there. But yeah, the beauty about using Google Earth is that you're able to kind of visit the site and kind of get a 3D kind of panoramic view of what the place looks like now. This particular marker here, I think, talks about talks about some of the early settlers to of Angola, but there was a spring here, and what you find is that a lot of the Seminole Maroon communities were close to water. The Suwannee River, for example, you had you had Bolex Town there, and then here at Manatee Mineral Spring, you had Angola. So just a sense of the location and where these places are, Angola being in Tampa Bay. All right, so I think it's 9 o'clock. I'll pause there. Does anyone have any questions? I definitely would love for you to check out the site. There are lots of other locations that you can visit. Um, you know, there are 18 sites in total. And so please, if you have an opportunity to get in there and to check it out, visit as many sites as possible. Each site has links that you can follow. Those links take you to archival documents that I've been able to get my hands on, newspaper clippings that I've been able to, been able to get my hands on that can kind of give you more details on the stories. Yes. Any questions? Gabriel.
I'm really glad for everything that's been shared tonight and documented, recorded as well, because I know when I got to go down to the lighthouse in Florida, it was interesting to see somebody not know about it. But one question I do have is more of a, I guess, an in-house cultural conversation. Whenever I think about the Underground Railroad and the Seminoles, and the Red Bay Seminoles, the way I was told and understood it was that there was a good mix of those who had indigenous Seminole ancestry and, of course, Gullah Geechee ancestry. Some were Black Seminoles in the sense of being separate in their own communities, but essentially renting. Others were intermingled with the Seminoles and literally, had multi-ethnic marriages. But what I've been curious about, I have noticed of late in some spaces, there's been almost like a push to say um, the Saltwater Railroad was entirely for Gullahs and Geechees. It was nothing to do with anything ethnically when it came to Seminoles. It was just Gullahs, and I know that's something that I kind of wrangle against. Not so much because of them not because of it never being the case that you had people that were 100% Gullah, but because of I get the messaging behind it that says that if we do acknowledge that there is indeed a mixture, then that means that we can't have exclusive rights. We being other groups that almost want to subsume the story.
Sure.
One culture giving aid and even training people with the dugout canoes how to get to Bahamas. And to be fair, also when I went to Bahamas, I believe in the Pompeii Museum.
Yeah, yeah. Downtown Nassau, yeah.
Yeah. There was one individual I talked with, and it was interesting because I saw the signage there, which was pretty good. They mentioned is it McCampy or Miccompy?
Micanopy, yeah.
Micanopy, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to make sure I said Micanopy. I'm glad they mentioned Micanopy being a huge supporter of the Red Bay Seminoles and others, but one of the leaders there had mentioned technically, the guys in the Red Bay, it was after I had just gone to visit them and to see for myself a couple years before. One of the administrators there said technically they call themselves Seminoles, but they used to be called 100% Maroons. And maybe that's because of messaging. And I don't know how much of an impact that's made on your work with the full
Yeah.
message.
Yeah. Now I've struggled with this too, actually, man. I'm glad you brought it up. It's tough because I've had conversations with some of the archaeologists in the Bahamas. There's a gentleman by the name of Michael Pateman. He is probably the nation's foremost archaeologist. And I asked him point blank, I said, do we have any, because he also does a lot of DNA work, a lot of genetics work. And he told me, he said, there's actually no DNA evidence that they have in their hands that suggests that anything other than the Black Seminoles being mostly African. And so I told him, I said, well, but you have all of these stories of intermarriage with the Seminole people in Florida, and you have, all these anecdotal stories of people, coming and even to Dr. Rosalind Howard, who did, a lot of the work. Her book is really the seminal, the seminal book on the Black Seminoles.
I love
Her
those books.
book Yeah, her book documents, Scipio Boleg and a gentleman by the name of, I think his name was Peter McQueen, who escaped, to Red Bays. And the McQueen name is definitely, an indigenous name. I think it's Creek.
Yeah.
And so, like, I know that I know that from the bowleg standpoint, the argument that I've been getting is, yes, these were Black Seminoles that just took the bowleg name. They didn't actually, they didn't actually marry anybody within, Chief Billy Bowleg's, family circle. But I don't know how good the DNA is. I don't know how extensive the DNA work is. But as of now, the nation's chief, archaeologist told me that there's actually no particular DNA evidence that suggests that anything else other than African um, people, settle in Red Bay. But if you look at some of the photos, if you look at some of the, even today, if you look at some of the people that live in Red Bays who carry the last name Boleg, you see,
Yeah,
it's hard to not, it's hard to not ask, well, but,
yeah,
um, and as a scientist, DNA is kind of like, gospel, but um, I think the jury is still out. I think we don't have enough DNA to definitively say that there's nothing. But right now, that's what everyone tells me. So I'm still very much on the fence on that as well. I'm
I
glad you
may,
brought it
if I may, two things. Number one, I know it's been years, but I did a lecture for a program in 2010 in California. And during the question and answer, a professor stood up and said, at that particular point, DNA evidence could be interpreted 3 or 4 different ways. So I don't know if that's still the case, but it might be. That's number one. Number two, and Gabriel, I may have shared this with you before. Well, I've been a longtime subscriber of the Seminole Tribune, the tribal newspaper out of Florida, for about 35 years or so. Uh, Tribal Chairman James Billy, who was chairman twice, made 2 trips to Red Bays, one in 2000, and I think the second one in 2011, 2012, around that time.
Yeah,
And he was highly impressed because when he did, he said he saw how the canoes and the baskets were made, reminded him of when he lived in his grandfather's camp in the Everglades when he was growing up. And he
that's
wanted
right.
those relatives from the Bahamas to actually come to the Autophagy Museum in Florida to teach the folks in Florida how to do that, because the folks in the Bahamas were doing it the old traditional way. So whether there's blood there or not, the relationships are definitely there, and some of that's been carried down to at least close to contemporary times.
Yeah, the Chickees and all of those things, reminded him of his community in Florida. But at the same time, I believe in one of the articles that I read, they didn't really they didn't really consider them to be Seminoles. They just, from a cultural standpoint, they said that they shared cultural leanings and things like that, but they didn't consider them to be like pure. I don't even know what's the right word to use. There's so much discussion on that.
Well, that's a whole other thing, because to say the least, our diaspora is diverse. So yeah, if you're a Seminole in the Bahamas, you're also a Seminole in Mexico. Yeah, there's some distinctions, but there are commonalities as well. And as I've said in other prior forums, leading up to the Second War, we weren't calling ourselves Seminoles. We were still primarily identifying ourselves by town names. So eventually, around the time of the Second War, meaning all those villages, as we came together in a loose alliance, we started to accept that term for ourselves. But how you define, well, my daughter summed it up a few years ago quite well when that mess, and some of the relatives here from Oklahoma might want to calm me down, but when folks out there started acting up, my daughter said, what's a full-blooded Seminole anyway? We're a mixture of many different people that came together.
And that's an argument that I haven't fully explored, but obviously when you talk about Seminoles, you're talking about lots of different indigenous people that were kind of melded together in Florida. It's not a pure anything, is it? It's creeks,
You
it's
preaching to the
Calusa,
converted here.
it's
that's kind of what I heard growing up as well. Like, even with the way the Seminole Nation was created, technically it was created the way it was after the War of 1812, more specifically within the Creek War, where you had the Red Stick Creeks joining forces, along with their Black Stick Creeks, or Creeks of African ancestry, including Creeks who were enslaved, Africans who were enslaved. They were never ethnically Creeks, but they were culturally Creek. They were brought together, they were mixed together with the Muskogee, Mississippi, and so forth. And on top of that, you have Maroons from
exactly.
Jamaica, from other spaces. And I think that's the thing that, to both of your points, that's what I've been wondering about in these conversations, because I have seen, this is just my experience, I've seen many excited about the history of the Underground Railroad going south to the Caribbean because it's such an unheard of thing in many spaces. However, it often feels that people are all vying to have exclusive rights on who gets I can't use for lack of better word, who gets the glory. So you have people in the Gullah community that will swear, those Seminoles were just Gullahs, erasing the history of people who were on the railroad, who actually were who are the DNA does lie. They had indigenous ancestry. And you have people on the indigenous side that they'll acknowledge it, but they'll still contrast what they're acknowledging with this idea of a pure blood, this idea that
Yeah.
the Seminoles were a pure blood people, rather than realizing that we were a conglomeration of multiple peoples that have since split off from that point since that time frame. You had, like Lonnie was saying, the Mississaugas and the Seminoles, um, the Muskogos out of Mexico. Then you have the Gullah community on the Low Country, and of course, for those who may have Seminole ancestry, Black Red Bay, you have Red Bay folks who left. I was told when I was in Bahamas, in Nassau, there was beef against the Red Bays for 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 others saying that they were from others. They said, well, they're too isolated and they want to get help from the nation, from the government, but they don't want to venture in. I was taken aback thinking, this is some pretty rich history, and there are always many wars happening. I'm just glad that we got freedom on the railroad, but this is an interesting ongoing conversation.
Yeah, very interesting conversation that still has many lanes to explore. And again, the focus a lot has been on the Red Bay community, but there's not been a whole lot of work on the Luthra Seminole community or the Bimini Seminoles. There was also a group that settled in Grand Bahama. So what I've been trying to do just over the last few years is just trying to follow strands wherever names show up, wherever ships show up in any newspaper articles. I try to track down those ships, try to figure out where the registry is for those vessels, whoever is on board, where they might have ended up, um, in any marriages that might have taken place. All those marriages would have usually taken place, and there would have been some type of record. For example, Mitchell Roberts, not a marriage record, but he built a boat called the Durable in 1836, and he had to register that boat. And in the write-up of the boat, he is described as, Red Bay resident, formerly of Florida, you know. So there's still lots of research to try to find, names and people and where they ended up. But um, I'm also interested in the connections between, the families in the Bahamas, the families in Oklahoma, the families in Mexico. And I wonder if there could ever be any DNA work to establish what, if any, genetic relationship exists, if there's any at all. I'm interested in that. Maybe that's something that we could talk about. And does anyone know anything of any DNA projects, by the past uh, or currently, that seeks to establish anything between the Mexico, folks in Mexico or folks in Texas or Oklahoma? Is there anything like that going on DNA wise?
No, I've never heard of anything like that, but something that I think is cool is the National Park Service, Dr. Diane Miller, back in 2012, invited someone from each part of the diaspora to a meeting in Florida. So that was the one time that I know of that sort of everybody got to come together and look at each other as cousins. I think she said that each person, a gentleman in the Bahamas by the last name of Wallace, had said that he was related to John Horse. And she said she had just come back from visiting Brackettville in Mexico. And some, of course, people there had said that they were related to John Horse as well. And she's like, these are cousins, And so she made it happen in 2012, where everybody came together to sort of just look at each other. So a DNA project, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, because it'd be nice to establish that link, not just,
Yeah.
conversationally or anecdotally, but actually, biologically. Kendrick Wallace, who is the son of, I think, the person who you spoke about, has been to the Angola Festival for the last 2 or 3 years. He brings his wood sculptures and his woodwork, and he does a workshop on woodworking and things like that when he's out there.
Yeah, because this Wallace was a woodworker as well. So the father passed it down to the son.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And Gabriel Sanchez had a question. I want to make sure he gets to ask his question.
Yeah, please.
Oh, only if there's time. But thank you so much. This has been so fascinating, and it's clear how much work you put into it. And I just really want to thank you for being here and sharing it. You kind of already alluded to my question in your previous response, so I put my hand down. But I did just want to ask you if, as in your work, if you've seen any indication outside of the Red Bay community of, did these people who found freedom in the Bahamas maintain a separate cultural identity past the first generation, or did they assimilate relatively quickly into, general like Afro-Bahamian culture and society? Was there still like a sense of a separate ethnic identity, or is there anything that you've come in, either through firsthand, like through documents or through oral history, about the maintenance of separate food practices or linguistic, anything like the differences in speech, or even just a sense of a separateness, or was that assimilation process take place pretty quickly?
That's a very good question, man. That's a very good question. In fact, there's a group of researchers right now that is down there doing kind of a survey of some of the, recent kind of events that are currently shaping the Red Bays community. There is quite a bit of assimilation. The community is very small, particularly in Red Bays. They are known specifically for their basket making. They are known specifically for their connection to the Seminole Indians or Seminole tribe of Florida. So but in terms of their day-to-day lifestyle, they are very much assimilated into what you would consider just to be Bahamian culture. If you were to walk into Red Bays and say, tell me who you are, most people just say, we's Bahamians. And I think that doesn't take away from the fact that Red Bay specifically has a unique spot in the Bahamian kind of, story. But most people don't even know about the about the depth of the Red Bay's Black Seminole story. And a lot of that storytelling, at least up until recently, had actually, been lost even in the Red Bay's community. And so there's a push now to really focus on preserving that history. And that's why the group of researchers are currently there. They're working to try to capture and hold on to as much of that cultural kind of, knowledge, traditional knowledge as possible, because it's being lost. It's being lost because many of the people that live in Red Bays are moving to Nassau to find jobs. They're moving to other parts of the country. And so the community is not what it used to be, when it was first established. I think when the road was constructed in the 60s, it opened up Red Bay to some of the other nearby communities, and things change over time. So there's definitely some assimilation, but there is a strong push now to try to preserve and to tell the Black Seminole story in Red Bay to as many people as possible in the Bahamas. That's a very good question you ask. Very good question.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah. Yeah, the challenge of Red Bays is such a small community. I think it fluctuates between 80 and 100 people. It's not really that very many people there, and there are other communities as well nearby to Red Bays. Now there's Nicholstown, there's Low Sound, there's other communities where people have kind of spread out as well. So it's not even just like per se Red Bays. Many of those people have married and moved out of the community and live on different parts of the island of Andros, and then some, of course, have moved to Nassau and Freeport and other places as well. Good question.
Misha brought up a really good point regarding Afro-Seminole Creole. We are working on revitalizing Afro-Seminole Creole, and one of the first things that I heard when we first started revitalizing it was, the purest that you'll probably hear it is in Red Bays. One of the ways that this language thrived was that there were long periods of isolation where it was able to, sort of incubate and grow. And then, the Black Seminoles would move on to their next part of the diaspora and have another period of isolation. And so that isolation happened in Red Bays. And from what I've been told, there is a mother and daughter who it's their vernacular. And I believe the mom's name is Agnes, if I'm not mistaken. And, we need to get down to go and hear her. I would love to be able to record her. Have you heard of this lady named Agnes?
I have not.
Yeah, I believe that's her name, but it's a mother and daughter who, speak Afro-Seminole Creole, fluently. That's their only language. And, if you want to hear how it sounds, listen to that.
Yeah. No, I would say in terms of the language in Red Bays currently,
Mhm.
And this is to Gabriel's point, because we talk about the Gullahs in general, and the fact that um, even the liberated Africans, and when you look at many of the individuals who escaped from any of those plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, they would have been individuals on, on the American East Coast, South Carolina, Carolina coast, the Sea Islands. And so when you listen to Bahamian people talk, Bahamian people sound just like those people in those Gullah communities. I don't know how much the the dialect shifts specifically in Red Bays. Everyone who I met from Red Bays, they sound just like a Bahamian would sound, just like a Gullah person would sound. But on every island, there's a slightly different accent. And certainly you could argue that overwhelmingly it's a Gullah tongue, or a Gullah sister tongue. There's been lots of research published on the connections between Gullah dialect and Bahamian Creole. I'm interested in what the Afro-Seminole Creole offers in terms of a distinction.
And I think there's one word that, and I don't remember because I don't have the dictionary in front of me, but I think it may be the slang term skiffy, that's found as far as Ian found only in Bahamian Creole and Afro-Seminole Creole. So there's at least one word that's unique to the two that could be the result of some kind of, either it
What
was
was that?
brought.
What was that word again, Gabriel? Help me out.
I believe it's skiffy. I can email you later if I get your email from Wendy to confirm. But that's found in Bahamian Creole and Afro-Seminole Creole, but not in other English-based Caribbean Creoles or Sea Island or Gullah, which could have been brought from Florida, or it could have come from some other foreign source, or it could have been more common and then lost, and just by coincidence kept in those two. But it does speak to some kind of connection linguistically.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the funny thing is, there hasn't been any follow-up ethnographical work of any substance since Dr. Howard. And so now these researchers that are currently there, Dr. Meryl Shriver Rice and her colleagues, they're doing a project that's funded by the British Museum, I think. They're doing a kind of a heritage project where they're essentially kind of, going back to Red Bays and asking questions and following up on some of the ethnographic work that was done by Dr. Howard to try to capture, what's currently happening at Red Bays now. What's the community doing now? How is it thriving? What changes have been observed? And so I'm very interested to see, what their research, uncovers.
There's something to add on to that too when it comes. I just mentioned the chat, and I think it's interesting because even with the Gullah aspect of the ancestry, Gullahs were also in large part created when people from Barbados were brought
Right.
from the slave trade. They were brought straight to Charlestown, which then became
Straight
Charles.
to the Sea Island coast. That's right. Yeah.
Right. And this is before stuff got developed in Bahamas.
That's correct.
For
Yeah.
the English. And so just the sharing of languages. My family is from Barbados. My
Okay.
mother, as well as Jamaica. So whenever I went to Bahamas and I went to Red Bays, of course I was seeing the different, dialects, but overall, my first thought was, yeah, this is how island folks talk. And then
That's right. Yeah.
and then within that, the similarities between Bayesian and Bahamian, are so evident.
Yeah. Yeah. For
But
example,
again,
no, that's no, no. That's so good, man. To see the similarities and the connections.
yeah, and how they would have taken those things down if they did come down after what war was it? After not war, but the Stoner Rebellion. If they would have come down to Florida, Spanish Florida, they would have brought their cultures from two different islands or more down with them, and then they would have had people from the islands coming up to join them in Florida while the Seminoles were having their various wars. So I think that's something that has to be considered at all times. That part of the legacy that we have to be proud of is how much of a not a melting pot but a jambalaya we are, and that was part of how we survived. But it's hard to have that conversation if there's this, to be blunt, this mindset that says, well, someone has to lose out. Someone has.
Right.
It's not, to me, it's not a scavenger hunt.
No, 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 no. No. I think of I know in Gullah, the term children, children. Now in the Bahamas, well, in Jamaica, you hear uno, because my wife's Jamaican, so you know her parents when you hear them talk, they say, how uno, But in the Bahamas, we have a variation. It's called yina, but it's the same root. So we would say yina children, go outside and play.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's just a slightly different pronunciation and
Yeah.
a slightly different spelling, but it's the same root. I think those connections really show the unity that exists
Yeah.
in our language. And
Yeah.
those things I hope we can explore. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I think DNA is another way that we can kind of bridge some gaps. But it takes a lot, I think, to get a DNA project and to get people who would be willing to commit to, donating samples and that kind of thing. That might be a lot.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Thank you for sharing that. That's
Yeah.
that's good stuff, man. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, are there any other
Appreciate it.
questions?
Yeah.
Going once, going twice. All right, well, Stefan, I want to say thank you for an amazing presentation. I knew you were going to knock it out the ballpark, so thank you, for everything. And anyone who wants to get in touch with you, is it all right to give them your email address, right?
Yeah,
All right,
please. And
I
then you
can
could
put it,
also connect. Yeah.
yeah,
Let me put my email address
yeah,
here.
please, thank you.
Um, And if you go to the website and if you have questions, you can shoot me an email in the contact section of the website. And I am, like I said, when I first started the presentation, I'm not a historian by training. I lean on the work of Dr. Dixon a lot, Dr. Anthony Dixon. He is a scholar that I have a lot of respect for. He knows the history inside and out. Dr. Rosalind Howard, as an anthropologist, I lean on her work. I lean on the work of Kenneth Porter. I lean on lots of different scholars who, have Larry Rivers, Dr. Larry Rivers. There are lots of scholars that I lean on, and what I've tried to do is to create a tool with the website that enables people to visit these sites virtually and to really connect with the land and to connect spatially with where these places are and where these stories have been told, and to try to retell the stories as best I can with the information that I've been able to get my hands on. But it's definitely a work in progress. I created a timeline on the website that tries to capture some important dates, but I haven't captured everything, man. There's so much to these stories, and there's so much that I don't know. And I think a part of the Underground Railroad is that clandestine, you don't know because you're not supposed to know, and that's to me, that's a beautiful part of the story. The fact that Black people did it the way they wanted to do it on the way that, and they didn't have to answer to anybody, and we don't need to leave a paper trail for you. I think that's beautiful in itself. And so, whatever information that I could find that inspires me and keeps me motivated to keep going, I publish. But I don't have all the documents. I don't have all the dates. And so, if you have content that you think is valuable and worth sharing, let's communicate. Let's stay in touch. I'm happy to hear and learn from you all as well. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much. And again, thank you everybody for joining the Zoom. As I say, you can be anywhere at any time, and you decided to join us this evening. So that's not lost on us at all. So thank you so, so much. And yeah, we're looking forward to putting this up on YouTube if you want to watch it again. Hopefully I'm getting better. So hopefully it'll be up tomorrow instead of like a week from now, because I don't know what I'm doing. So, but again, thank you so much. This has been incredible. And, reach out to Stefan, any questions you have for him. That's how we keep this conversation going, So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.